Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Hyperabyssic Ontology, Part 14. The Four Who Entered Paradise. The path of magical initiation symbolized by the ascent of the Tree of Life is fraught with dangers, involving as it does the inversion upon the imaginary that underlies the structure of the psyche. Like any form of depth psychology, neurotic and even psychotic symptoms can result from this process. There is a traditional Jewish story frequently referred to in Kabbalistic literature that sheds useful light on the processes and dangers involved. The famous narrative is set in the early 2nd century and comes from the Babylonian Talmud in section Hagigah 14b, which was compiled in the late 5th century from material accumulated in late antiquity. The passage reads, Our rabbis taught, 4 entered an orchard, Pardes, and these are they: Simon ben Azai, Simon ben Zoma, Aher, that is to say, Elisha ben Avuya, and Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef. Rabbi Akiva said to them, When you reach the stones of pure marble, do not say, Water, water, for it is said, He that speaketh falsehood shall not be established before mine eyes. Psalm 101, verse 7. Ben Azai gazed and died. Of him Scripture says, Precious is the sight of in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. Psalms 116, verse 15. Ben Zoma gazed and was stricken. Of him Scripture says, Hast thou found honey? Eat as much as is sufficient for thee, lest thou be filled therewith and vomit it. Psalms 25:16. Aher cut down the shoots. Rabbi Akiva departed in peace. Unquote. The Talmud's use of the word Pardes, which is genealogically cognate with the English word paradise, is borrowed from the Persian language, where it refers to a walled garden or orchard, typically set aside for private use of the aristocracy. The contextual usage designates the sacred heavenly domain of the divine reality, corresponding to the regions above the abyss on the Tree of Life. In antiquity, Jewish sages practiced visualizations of either the divine Merkabah, or chariot, or Hekalat, throne, accompanied by verbal permutations of various divine names, the Judaic equivalent of the Greco-Roman barbarous names of evocation, to cause the soul to ascend in vision to the heavenly palace of God without permanently severing its attachment to the physical body. It has generally been presumed in the Kabbalistic tradition that this was the method used by the rabbis in question to enter heaven. In the worldview of the Hebrew Scriptures, the flat plate of the earth is covered by the dome of the firmament, which separates the organized space of creation from the Tehom, the primordial waters that preceded the origin of the world recounted in Genesis. Gates in the dome of the firmament open to allow these waters through, accounting for the rains that water the earth. God's palace is located above the roof of the dome of the firmament, and the stones of its floor are transparent, through which the swirling waters of Tehom are visible. Hence the exhortation to those who visit the palace not to say the word water aloud, as this would involve blasphemously bringing chaos into the presence of the Most High. Those who transgress are chased down by angelic guardians who dramatically slay them in punishment. Psychoanalytically, this prohibition clearly expresses a repressed fear of the feminine represented by water, illegally transgressing upon the exclusively male domain of the Hebrew God. In the new eon, it may therefore prove necessary to subvert or otherwise reevaluate the traditional patriarchal interpretation of these commandments. In the Thelemic tradition, the task of the divine feminine is to reawaken the eld of the All-Father by broaching the Oedipal isolation from intimacy enforced by the masculine role under patriarchy. There are several apparent allusions to this narrative of divine ascent in the Book of the Law. The fool readeth this book of the law, and its comment, and he understandeth it not. Let him come through the first ordeal, it will be to him as silver. Through the second, gold. Through the third, stones of precious water. Through the fourth, ultimate sparks of the intimate fire. Yet to all it shall seem beautiful. Its enemies who say not so are mere liars. Chapter 3, verses 63 to 68. The reference to understanding alludes to Binah and the communing with Neshama that is the goal of magical gnosis. 4 stages of divine ascent are described, representing a successive comprehension of the 4 Kabbalistic worlds. First, in Asiya, the magician must gain control over the Nefesh, symbolized by silver, which alchemically corresponds to the moon, which relates to Yesod, the seat of the Nefesh on the Tree of Life. Second, in Yetzirah, the Ruach, centered in Tifereth, is oriented towards the true well communicated by Neshama. Gold is alchemically assigned to the sun, which corresponds to Tifereth on the tree. Third, in Bria, which is watery in comparison to Atziluth's fiery quality, the stones of precious water, is clearly an allusion to the flagstones of the heavenly temple in the story of the 4 who entered paradise. Finally, in Atziluth, the sparks of the intimate fire represent the blazing flame of divine union, in which any remaining sense of separation from the nothingness of the Kabbalistic zero is consumed. The divine ascent through the 4 worlds is further described in the Book of the Law in the following passage. Behold, there are 3 ordeals in one, and it may be given in 3 ways. The gross must pass through fire, let the fine be tried in intellect, and the lofty chosen ones in the highest. Thus ye have star and star, system and system, let not one know well the other. Chapter 1, verse 50. The 3 ordeals are in one, which makes 4, as Atziluth represents the unity of the antecedent 3 worlds. The gross passing through fire refers to the allegory of alchemical distillation and of the separation of the spiritually fine from the base and gross. This relates to Asiya and the ordeal of the Nefesh. Once separated out, the fine must be tried in intellect, which is the level of the Ruach and of Yetzirah, where the opposition between the influx of mercy and severity, or emotion and rationality, must be equilibrated within the conscious faculties of the psyche. Finally, the highest represents the supernal level of the tree, the worlds of Bria and Atziluth, and the attainment of Neshama. At this point, the unique star self of each human existent is freed to shine forth and orbit along the path of its true will as part of the company of heaven. In another verse of the Book of the Law, the story of the 4 who entered paradise is again referenced. There are 4 gates to one palace. The floor of that palace is of silver and gold. Lapis lazuli and jasper are there in all rare scents, jasmine and rose and the emblems of death. Let him enter and turn at once the 4 gates. Let him stand on the floor of the palace. Will he not sink? Ho, warrior, thy servants sink. But there are means and means. 151. The palace is the heavenly paradise of the story. Its 4 gates are the 4 Kabbalistic worlds, which can be accessed singly or altogether at once, since the human person is composed by and is therefore extended in all 4 worlds. Also, the 4 gates symbolize the 4 rabbis in the folk tale, as well as the 4 rivers that pass through the Garden of Eden that are mentioned in Genesis. Silver and gold are the Nefesh and Ruach, respectively, and they are said to lie below the floor of the palace because the palace is established at the level of the supernals and of Neshama above the level of the 2 lower souls upon the Tree of Life. Jasmine and rose are funerary incenses, while the emblems of death are the symbols upon the tracing board presented to the initiate of the 3rd degree of Freemasonry, the degree where the mysteries of death are celebrated through the enactment of the myth and the murder of Hyperabyssic, the architect of King Solomon's temple. Death is a metaphor for the transcendence of the limited psychological perspective of the 2 lower souls, in place of the larger whole represented by Neshama. But can the magician maintain this perspective? Can they stand on the floor of the palace and not sink back to the mundane viewpoint of the vulgar herd of the unenlightened? Or will they succumb to the madness of obsession and spiritual death that threatens the path of initiation, like what happened to 2 of the rabbis who entered paradise? Returning to the Jewish legend, the story of the 4 who entered paradise depicts 4 possible results of the divine vision. It's represented by the different fates of the 4 rabbis. These are death, madness, heterodox apostasy, and the reinforcement of orthodoxy. It should be stressed that these all result from genuine illumination. all four rabbis spiritually purified themselves and achieved a kind of enlightenment to be eligible to experience the vision of the divine domain. These results thereby stand beyond good and evil on a vulgar human scale of values and need to be more subtly interpreted than in terms of the various characters in the story being either good or bad in a conventional sense. However, although I here fully endorse a post-theistic reading of the legend of the four who entered paradise, I would also emphasize that Nietzsche's appeal to the philosopher to be beyond good and evil is coupled with his insistence on the hermeneutical ultimacy of will to power, meaning that human beings are value-positing social beings who cannot exempt themselves from this role. Some kind of morality is always implied in the judgments we make, and we are responsible for their consequences. If we assume that the death of God means that we should now be evil, then we are not being beyond good and evil. On this basis, Nietzsche was therefore a fierce critic and opponent of the evil of modern nihilism, yet he also rejects any conservative appeal to the naive immediacy of the good of traditional morality, as providing a valid alternative to nihilism. Indeed, all such appeals are themselves nihilistic, because they deny and obstruct the human potential to posit new social values that are contextually appropriate for modern subjectivity. I interpret the search for such values as equivalent to the quest for the true will in thelemic magic. For example, what value should death have for us as modern subjects for whom the god of metaphysics is also dead? In the story, this is the fate of Ben Azai, and Kabbalistic lore is filled with tales of those who entered the divine presence being literally burned up by the overwhelming power of the sacred majesty. Without the equilibrating function of Geburah, operating below the abyss to safely limit and regulate the flow of the divine energies into the Ruach, they will overwhelm and shatter whatever vessels attempt to contain them. Only the magician whose name is Nemo, or No One, and who has fully understood their ultimate identity with Ayin, the Kabbalistic nothingness, can withstand the direct encounter with the ground of being. Yet, death remains the end point of every human existence. In Martin Heidegger's influential meditations upon this theme in the second division of Being and Time, he emphasizes that dying is not an event, it is a phenomenon to be understood existentially. What he means is that since death is the end of personal experience, it is not itself an experience that we can personally have. Death defines the limit of experience. It is therefore impossible to directly experience it, like the edge of our visual field which is always present, yet which we never see. We can observe others die, but never ourselves. As it is written in the book of the law, death is forbidden no man unto thee. As the boundary and limit of human existence, the phenomenon of death defines its totality. Human existence remains outstanding in its historical possibilities for being until its death, at which point it achieves totality. And this achievement is also its self-negation, according to the negative dialectic of the ultimacy of the Kabbalistic zero. Heidegger writes, just as Dasein, meaning human existence, is already its not yet, and is its not yet constantly as long as it is already its end too. The ending which we have in view when we speak of death does not signify Dasein's being at an end, but a being towards the end of this entity. Death is a way to be, which Dasein takes over as soon as it is, unquote. In other words, human existence has a special quality of being able to project itself towards its possibilities for being, not just haphazardly and at random, but in terms of its potential to become a totality. Since this totality is only fully realized at death, Heidegger names this quality being towards death, and he insists that with death, Dasein stands before itself in its ownmost potentiality for being. By ownmost is meant the unique possibility for existence of each human existent, disclosed through their authentic relationship to their own being towards death. So, why not call this existential attribute of being towards life? Heidegger's point is not to promote a mawkish obsession with death and dying, but instead to make a more subtle dialectical argument that our access to infinitude comes through our relationship to finitude. Our lives have the ultimate significance for us that they do because they are limited in time, at least personally, if not impersonally, by means of the jouissance of the death drive of the true will. As it is written, Strive ever to more, and if thou art truly mine, and doubt it not, and if thou art ever joyous, death is the crown of all. Chapter 2, verse 72. Death is the end of the limited personal self, yet it also marks the decisive attainment of the formerly unlimited impersonal self because, importantly, the causal influence of the true will upon the world does not end with the conclusion of personal experience, but continues indefinitely to work its way in the world. To the extent we identify our true self with the post-mortem effects of our actions, either through our progeny or through other social projects and creative endeavors, that in this sense we can attain material immortality, not in another heavenly world, but in this very world. The second fate of the four who entered paradise is madness. Ben Zoma is said to have been stricken, and this is traditionally interpreted as meaning that he became mentally disassociated from social consensus reality because of his mystical attainment. This is analogous to the holy beggars in India, who are called masts, and who are said to have gone mad with divine realization. Insanity is a difficult category of experience to grasp phenomenologically, because the sanity it is thematically opposed to is a robustly socially constructed concept, and not at all an immediately given empirical reality. The philosopher and cultural historian Michel Foucault has done a great deal of work on this theme, for example, in his History of the Clinic and other books, emphasizing the role of social control by systems of political power in the definition of and institutional treatment of madness. Foucault's basic theoretical category for critiquing the relationship between presumed psychological normativity and systems of social control is what he calls power knowledge. Power knowledge is a restatement of the originally Marxist idea that the practice of science always has an ideological context through which its results are interpreted, and that this context is suffused with competing relations of social power. In other words, power and knowledge are not separate categories in the practice of science, but rather dialectically one implies and is linked to the other. Knowledge is sought in order for human beings to obtain power over their environment, and conversely, those who seek power over others develop and deploy the presumed objectivity of knowledge to obtain their ends. Therefore, in the context of the psychological sciences, who gets defined as crazy very often serves to justify and facilitate their political oppression. As a queer man at a time when homosexuality was widely medically pathologized and on that basis criminalized, Foucault was personally well aware of the practical implications of his theory. In addition to its Marxist underpinnings, to understand Foucault's basic argument, the critical orientation of the psychoanalytic tradition as founded by Sigmund Freud is of crucial importance, especially given the many attempts to obscure and confuse this legacy by later liberal and humanistic psychologists, running from Carl Jung to both sides of the so-called Freud wars of the 1980s. As developed in Civilization and Its Discontents and other works, Freud's Jewish difference towards the larger Christian European society of his time results in his work having a highly critical attitude towards bourgeois culture. Gentile intellectuals such as Carl Jung were very uncomfortable with Freud's conclusions and inauthentically attempted to rescue psychoanalysis as a science from Freud's decadence, a thinly veiled expression of anti-Semitic prejudice. This is why so-called humanistic psychology generally rejects the Oedipal theory of the psyche, and with it the idea that modern culture as such is insane, which causes individuals to become insane. Instead, for Jung and his diverse followers, the bourgeois social world is basically sane. Mentally unwell individuals have simply fallen out of harmony with society and need merely be brought back into conformity with it again to become productive workers and family members. Whereas for Freud, the family is fundamentally problematic, and so is the larger society developed out of the patriarchal norms established in the nuclear family. Here I am intent to avoid this problematic misreading of Freud's work, instead following the lead of Slavoj Žižek and the Lacanian Marxist interpretive tradition, of which he is the major proponent, by insisting on the relevance of the basic critical insight underlying Freud's theory of the Oedipal complex, which is that the emergence of linguistic subjectivity is inherently traumatic, and therefore that the psyche is necessarily an incomplete phenomenon whose excessive jouissance can never be reconciled with the consensus reality of any organic hierarchical notion of society. What this means in practical psychological terms is that there is no such thing as being normal. We are all crazy, out of balance in our relationship to society, and it is through fidelity to the creative potential of our madness that we gain access to our deepest authentic potentiality for being, what in Thelema is called the true will. However, and this is the really important point, to more fully enjoy your symptom, as Lacan puts it, we must all the more take personal and cooperative collective responsibility for the social consequences of our behavior. If do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, then it necessarily follows from this principle that love is the law, love under will. For how can we truly and authentically enjoy ourselves as social animals if our actions produce only hatred and harm? Hence the value of magic as a therapeutic paradigm to promote the always excessive madness called love. However, it then does no practical good to simply just go crazy and proclaim that this is equivalent to magical attainment. The second order equilibrium of a more complex dialectic is called for to understand the potential for human enlightenment and liberation in the context of the modern life world. If we need to recognize that we are all mad, then we must also strive to be at the same time sane. To be able to enjoy the jouissance of our symptoms, we need to develop coping strategies for sublimating our neurotic behavior that work for the people around us by avoiding violence and abuse. If trauma cannot be absolutely negated because Oedipal subjectivity is inherently traumatic, then we must learn how to constructively relate to our trauma in ways that are creatively fulfilling instead of miserably neurotic. If subjectivity itself is a mode of narcissism, as Lacan argues, then it is also simultaneously the case that the subject is inherently and inescapably social as well. Individuality is always and already social, even while society is a virtual illusion, irreducibly composed of unique individuals who can never be completely conformed to it. In such a context, democratic cooperation is not just a good idea, it is necessary for our very political survival as a species, lest we be destroyed by the alienated tyranny of the social world we are ourselves the creators of, which should serve our purposes instead of being the vehicle of our oppression. Having authentically oriented ourselves in being towards death and therapeutically adjusted to our inherent madness, there remains the two other existential options for those who have entered paradise. This is expressed in the folk tale by the opposition between Akiva and Aher, which represents the opposition between orthodoxy and heterodoxy, or the conservation of tradition versus the admixture of assimilation. Rabbi Akiva is the type of the conservative, who in the tale gives voice to the admonition not to say water, water, in the presence of the divine, lest the purity of what is highest become mixed with what is other. Indeed, the name Aher, given to his rival, Rabbi Elisha ben Avuya, means the other. Akiva is the strict legalist in his interpretation of Torah observance, his maxim being no mercy and justice. His teaching emphasizes the strict distinction between God and God's creation. Where it is written in Genesis that human beings were created in the image of God, Akiva reads this passage as saying that human beings were not created in the image of God, but only after an image, based on a spiritual archetype created by God, but not based directly on God's being. His position is therefore anti-Gnostic in character, denying the similitude of humanity and the divine. Akiva took part in the third and final Jewish-Roman war, the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 136 CE, as an anti-colonial partisan and was executed by the Romans at the conclusion of the conflict. After the war, the Jewish population of Judea was further displaced and dispersed in punishment throughout the ancient world, extending the condition of diaspora and exile of the Jewish community, during which the preserved teachings of Akiva and the other early rabbis were instrumental in maintaining their distinctive ethnic identity and culture. In contrast to Akiva's strict traditionalism, Aher represents the alternative option of constructive assimilation and the reinterpretation of tradition when faced with challenging and changing historical conditions. As a result, he was considered anathema in the medieval rabbinical tradition. Yet there has been a revival of interest in him as a more positive, or at least ambiguous, figure in the context of modern Reform or secular cultural Judaism. Similarly, for Thelemic ceremonial magicians of both Jewish and Gentile extraction, relating to the Kabbalah from a postmodern, heterodox, magical perspective, he serves as a useful role model, and perhaps even as a heroic exemplar. Aher's teachings emphasize that the lived relevance of religious observance is equal to the importance of Torah study. In other words, practical spiritual experience is just as important to the knowledge as the knowledge of tradition. Indeed, he seems to imply that only through the former does the interpretation of the latter truly become possible. It is even said that after his mystical attainment, he no longer viewed strict Torah observance as mandatory for himself or for others, innovating his own mystical and magical practices in their place. Aher placed practice over dogmatism. He was also interested in Gentile culture and studied Greek literature. It is said that he kept forbidden books hidden in his lap while studying in the Beit Midrash, and that these spilled out when he stood up. Were these forbidden texts perhaps the Hermetica or other Greek magical writings? The story of the four who entered paradise says that he cut the shoots, and this is usually interpreted as meaning that he encouraged boys engaged in Torah study to assimilate by learning trades relevant in Greek and Roman society. Aher was a prime example of an epikuros, a word derived from Epicurean, and meaning a hybrid practitioner of both Jewish halakha and Greek philosophy, leading to a selective non-observance of the Mosaic law. Aher did not join in the Bar Kokhba revolt and was spared the fate of Akiva and the other rebels, dying later of natural causes instead. Finally, the pro-Gnostic character of Aher's teachings is emphasized in a story preserved in the Talmud, in section Haggadah 15a, which recounts what happened to him when he was in heaven. The story says that he saw the angel Metatron seated beside the divine presence and said to himself, "There are two in heaven." According to Jewish legend, Metatron was originally the patriarch Enoch, who, like Moses and Elijah, did not suffer physical death, but was instead taken up into heaven, where his body was transformed into angelic form and seated at the right hand of God as their chief vizier, replacing the fallen Lucifer, who had previously occupied this position. Although traditionally viewed as a heretical utterance, Aher's recognition of the originally human Metatron as being divine just like God implicitly affirms the esoteric Gnostic insight that human beings are inherently non-dual with the divine. Hermeneutics is retroactive. The interpretation of the past always involves importing an agenda from the present. This feature of historical narration that is both necessary and normative. However objective the facts are that have been recovered, their meaning not only must but should be informed by the contemporary concerns of the historian. However, for the interpretation of history to be adequately critical and not just naively prejudiced, the interpreter's hermeneutical prehensions need to be self-consciously explicit and therefore themselves subject to critical evaluation. My own agenda in the preceding discussion of the four who entered paradise has been oriented around the potential relevance of this folktale for Thelemic magicians practicing a theurgy of liberation. Likewise, for the structure of the Tree of Life and the system of Kabbalah it encodes that comprises the theme of this Hyperabyssic Ontology as a whole. For historically embedded agents in other contexts and other times in history, the significance of the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, and indeed of the category tradition as such, may be very different from what I have laid out here. These differences remain part of the larger conversation of human history, but it is up to us in the present to creatively reinterpret the past to explore its relevance for postmodern practitioners of any ethnic background. This can be done respectfully and intelligently, informed by a scholarly contextual understanding of the materials in question, or alternatively, reinterpretation can be appropriate and ignorant, only reinforcing the racism that led to the suppression of the Kabbalah in modern times, and with it the loss of the gnosis that is the dark legacy of the Aeon of Osiris. For those with eyes to see, the potential for Gnostic enlightenment is hermeneutically coded in the symbolism of the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. The Lacanian interpretation of the tree I've outlined in these lectures offers a powerful template for magical liberation. The challenges of practice are great, however, given the historical limitations imposed by modernity. Defiant, the true will names the choice and the quest for creative action deferred and denied within the life world of commodity culture. Love is the law, love under will.